spent on judicial reform projects across the world, I don't think that we have a very coherent answer to these questions. And I'm also excited that this research team is tackling it, because I know that regardless of the answer that you eventually arrive at, this is going, you're going to give us a compelling story. So I'm excited about that. I think that overall that based on the analysis that you've shown us thus far and all the robustness checks that you've got and all the appendices, I think that this seems like a really reasonable empirical strategy. And so I'm going to focus instead on some of the questions that I had, or reservations that I had with the causal story that you set up at the front. And specifically, the first thing that it all seems plausible, right? You found this connection, this empirical correlation between donor funds related to democracy or judicial reform and aggregate judicial independence, right? And so you find that there's a positive correlation, but that the marginal effects of this decrease during election time. And this is plausible, but I also I want to see or have this be more concretely illustrated key components that's going to connect these two things. So one question I had was just, what are these reforms, right? How is it, and not only what are these reforms, but how are these reforms moving the LJI index of, Linzer and Staten? So, I think from what I understand, or, the piece of real estate where I've studied these judicial reforms, lots of them tend to be technocratic solutions or legalistic solutions, most of which are targeted at lower courts or auxiliary, justice system institutions like the prosecutor general or the attorney general or whatever. And so it's just not necessarily clear, or I think there's opportunity to just give more information about the reforms and then give, what is the expectation or exactly the mechanism or the sub-index through which we should see variation in the DV, right, that you've chosen. And one of the other questions that I have is the assumption that you make about leaders' motivations, because I think it's totally plausible that leaders in these countries would like to attract external investment, and they say, hey, maybe making these justice sector reforms, will make courts more independent, and that will, signal to the external community that they should invest here. But I'm also just cynical that what they're also not trying to do is just simply take advantage of the fact that there's all these donor agencies and donor countries that are flush with money and want to give money, contribute money to good-sounding projects like, judicial reforms that then go directly into government coffers, right? And I think that I think tying this together and just showing us that this is the connection, I think will do a lot to strengthen your argument. And this it ties in also with the elections, the claim about the elections. We've got at some points a picture of these leaders who would be, on the one hand, sort of willing to toy with the opposition or suppress the opposition, but at the same time, promote judicial independence ostensibly, right? And which seems like maybe working at cross purposes, or also just begs questions about what these judicial reforms are really meant to do. So I think that's probably 5 minutes. I don't know. I have more, but we can pass the hat. So. Okay.
Do any of the discussants want to build on that, or should we just move on to Eddie?
Actually, mine builds on that almost exactly, so that's perfect. Yeah. Okay, so hi from Harry Potter World. So I'm taking a break, an escape, and actually this is a lot more fun than Harry Potter World. So I have basically 4 points that I want to make, and I'll try and hit them really quickly. The first one builds off exactly what Amanda was just saying, and I couldn't agree more. But I'm actually gonna draw a bold line around it. So I like this paper a lot. I think it's a really interesting approach. It deals with something that we don't see a lot of. It's ambitious because it's trying to take on a lot of different legal institutions around the world and trying to come up with a common theory. And I think it's always really interesting to know, what effects does aid have. But I do think that this paper stands or falls based on this dependent variable. I think this is going to be the thing that you've got to really sort out. And when you look at this dependent variable, it's really not clear because of the nature of it. And I went actually and read the Linzer and Staten paper to try and see what I could understand about it. And I have a hard time telling. I understand what they're trying to do, which is differentiate between de jure and de facto. But I have a hard time understanding what is actually moving when we talk about what judicial independence is. And this has a really critical meaning in how you interpret these results, because is this real institutional change? That is, the courts were made independent and the government tied its hands, and then this is going to block the opportunities for them to abuse the court system in the future? Or is this just de facto and they kind of stayed away from it in election years? And it's not clear from the current dependent variable which one it is. And so, and I think the second one, kind of de facto independence, is not nearly as interesting, right? Because then it's just, yeah, well, the donor said that I couldn't intervene in the court system, and so I didn't during an election year. But in the year of a non-election, but in an election year, it's really, really important. And so now I've got to get in here and intervene. And I think that's the problem, because then what that really means is that the court system is not truly independent. You haven't changed anything. You've just forced them not to do it in times when it doesn't matter. And so when other court cases come up where it really does matter. So just to be, I misspoke for a second. I want to be clear about it. It's if you only get them to change things when the court cases don't matter, and it's de facto changes, I'm not sure that what we really have. So I actually would like you to do something, which is if you can break out the actual coding of the Linzer and Staten and sort of disaggregate it, I would like to see real institutional changes as your dependent variable. And if you can do that, then I think it's a really convincing paper, because then that's effectively the government saying, yeah, we agree to tie our hands going forward. Oh, I saw a two-finger on that. Joe, do you want a two-finger?
Yeah, sorry. My voice is, thanks so much, Eddie. My voice has gone bad, so forgive me. What specifically do you have in mind when you say real institutional changes? That's a big category.
Yeah, I mean, so I would like to see changes like, no more appointments of courts by this, no more direct appointment of judges by the leaders, or budgets that a separate budget line that isn't controlled, or terms of the judges that extend beyond the electoral cycles of politics, but things that actually insulate them from politics, right? Rather than just them not intervening, because them not intervening could just be opportunistic. The second one, and I'm going to put on my, Simona wants a two-finger on this.
Yeah, so in other words, so if we got a better measure of compliance with court decisions by the incumbent, would that get closer to what you were trying to?
Like when we're talking about institutional change, we're talking about hand tying.
Yeah.
We're saying that I agree not just to intervene when it's bad for me, but I'm taking away my ability to intervene going forward, right? So I'm actually tying my hands for future court cases, even ones that matter a lot to me. So it can't be anything that's just not compliance in a particular time, because that just could be evidence of opportunistic behavior. It has to be I'm making this difficult for me to intervene going forward. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure.
Okay.
And that's got to be budget, appointment, term length, right? To do it. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Tim wants in on this. Okay. How come none of you guys did this to Amanda? All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so just really quickly, it seems to me that there are at least two things that you might be able to do here, right? One is these component parts on the basis of which the latent variable is constructed are as such available, right? So you could reconstruct that index just taking the de facto elements basically out of it, and still get most of the benefit, presumably. You end up with two variables, right? And then you can test quite directly, it seems to me, what Eddie just said. The other part is it might be, as a preliminary analysis, just to regress these measures on your metrics of contested elections and see whether by itself there are actually these dips in those contested election years, right? Eddie's concern here, if that's borne out, then you need to worry about that a lot more, it seems to me. If you find that actually by itself that's not showing up, then that seems less likely, although then you still need to worry, of course, about what actually explains your findings.
Yeah. So I agree with both of those points. I'm a little bit concerned about the de jure members in Linzer and State, because one of them's just coming straight out of polity, and I'm not sure how accurate it is, but I generally agree with that. And the other thing is, like, Tim made a really good point, but I'm not 100% I agree that even if you found, I agree that if you find that they intervene in elections even without the aid, the conditional effective aid, then that's a real problem for your theory. I'm not sure that if you find that they still intervene only when aid causes it, it could be simply just opportunistic responding to the aid in a given year. It's still not institutional change, so I'd just be a little bit careful about that. Okay, I have 3 more points, and I'll rush through them quick. As a comparativist, I do think there is this other question that you have to worry about, which is endogenous elections in parliamentary systems, where you have snap elections that are caused for opportunistic reasons by politicians, and you don't say anything about that, and you're assuming that the elections are coming up on a fixed term, and if there's no confidence votes or before that, you can move that election cycle around as you see fit, and there's whole literatures about that, so you should think a little bit about that, and maybe drop the set that has the ability to have endogenous elections and see if your results still hold in there. The third thing on the identification strategy, I don't want to get into whether the exclusion criterion is met or not, but it did. It kind of strikes me as weird that when you think about aid budgeting. So I do a lot of work on aid projects, and budgets really aren't on a 1-year cycle, especially governance and judicial independence ones. These are usually 5-year cycles where it comes out. And you're estimating off of this 1-year cycle, which is really strange, because then if you were sort of programmed for 5 years, but you're still seeing these big movements on an annual basis, a lot of what's driving your identification strategy is noise. When you think about it, right? Because this is unemployment that can't possibly be connected with aid, because the aid was budgeted on longer term cycles. So I just be a little bit worried about that, because it's not that it's not independent. It's just that what is it that we're actually seeing unemployment actually have an effect on, right? So you might want to take like a moving average of aid rather than an individual year to get at it. And then finally, I know other people will pick up on this, but Figure 2 and Figure 3, the marginal effects. Some of the marginal effects are significantly different from 0. But sometimes they're not significantly different from each other in elected years versus non-elected years, and so I wasn't sure sometimes how to interpret that when you had a marginal effect off a dummy variable that was basically the same size whether it was election or not, and you guys didn't do a lot of sort of probing in the paper about that, so maybe you guys can talk about that in your response. But look, I think like these problems that I'm pointing out, these are just the types of problems you get in an ambitious project where there's not a lot of great data. So, and this is kind of what makes it fun to try and solve them. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Eddie. Right, let's move on to Emily.
Thanks for having me. So, I have a couple of presentational points, and then most of my comments are directly building on what Amanda and Eddie have said, which is and the first point, I come to this with a background in judicial independence, and so I know that literature, I know what our expectations are in judicial independence and how it works and what we're looking for and things like that, and so I see how this is really valuable in that literature, and I have no idea what the aid literature is. So I have no sense of whether I should expect aid to generally be working or to not generally be working, or under what conditions it should generally work. And so I'd like, just a couple of paragraphs about what the scholarly state of the literature is on how aid might affect this. I know we haven't looked at judicial independence before, but how does it affect other kinds of institutional building, and that would give me a little bit of context as to whether I should generally think it would work or not. I also found, so in, I would suggest that, so I generally think that what you guys have done in the empirical section is so precise and has very clear expectations as to what you expect from different kinds of permutations of all of these measures and what exactly the concepts are supposed to look like and how you would measure them. And those precise expectations are not coming across in your theory. So in general, I feel like your hypotheses could be more clear as to what the counterfactual would be and how elections are defined and which kinds of elections this should apply to. And I feel like there's a lot of scope conditions as to what your expectations are in your theory that are not coming across in this presentation. So yeah, anyway, but my real comments are about exactly what has been said before. And so I think what Eddie and Amanda are trying to suggest is that it's not super clear what your concept of changes in judicial independence mean. So when I think of how aid should affect changes in judicial independence in the state, this is what I would expect to be a slow process of long-term changes, of policy changes, of changing constitutional expectations of what an executive is or is not allowed to do. This is a slow process that affects the overall picture of what judicial independence looks like as a de facto and a de jure sense, right? So the Linzer and Staten measures should capture exactly that. When I think of how an executive is going to interact with the court in the period of an election, when he is in desperate need of changing the court's status, then that may not be. This may be that he's disobeying particular orders. It may be that he is changing budgets in a very off-book sense. It may be that he's doing fast changes that are not the same as a constitutional change that would protect the court, right? So the actions that I think that are taken against a court are different from the ones that are taken to improve a court as an institution and under the conditions that are advised by these technical advisors. And so I feel like these are different kinds of interactions with the court, and you're treating them like they're the same process. And I don't know if this is exactly what everybody else has been trying to suggest, but that's how I feel like it. So I feel like the process, the connection between aid and judicial independence is a slow one, and the connection between elections and judicial independence in the negative sense is a fast one. And these are things that don't necessarily kind of combine into the same measure. And it's definitely something that the Linzer and Staten measure isn't going to capture. If there are small dips, if these are off-the-radar dips, if they are non-compliance, which is different from manipulation, etc. So it's not super clear in your setup what you think the concept is of how these things change. I also think that there are lots of reasons that an executive would have to manipulate the court, and it's not just limited to election cycles, right? So, of course, what I'm going to argue is basically conflict with your population, or conflict in a more general sense. So whenever the executive is experiencing any kind of threat to his regime, whether that be a behavioral threat or an institutional threat in the form of an election cycle, then there are incentives for him to manipulate the court in his advantage and against his opposition. And I think that those would also be conditions under which we would see the executive preferring to manipulate the court rather than responding to the aid conditions that have been set. So I am almost left with this position of feeling like I don't know exactly what the conditions would be under which a state would let the conditions of the aid dominate. Like, what are the conditions under which it would be perfectly fine in order to follow these aid conditions when they are something that really are kind of small, right? You've even said that there are not that much aid is actually given towards judicial reform. So I have a hard time buying the connection between aid and the election cycle. I'm sorry, or the aid and the court itself. That's it.
Okay, is that it, Emily? I think you sort of froze on my screen. Yeah.
Am I up next, or is it a?
Yes, so Eric, why don't you go?
Okay, all right, great. So I'm going to echo a lot of the things that have already been said. I really love the question. There's been so much efforts to, towards aid that is aimed at changing the functioning of courts in other countries, and we don't really know if it works. But I'm going to make 3 points, but the first one is basically echoing what Amanda and what Eddie and what Emily have already said. It's this concept of judicial independence, but I'm just going to say it in a different way, which is always what we do, right? We say the same things in slightly different ways, and hopefully that's useful. So first of all, I think you're very inconsistent in the paper about what judicial independence really is. So you talk about strengthening of the judiciary, making courts work better, strengthening the rule of law, those kinds of things, which is what a lot of these aid programs are really about. They're often about administrative courts, about lower level courts. That's not judicial independence. Or judicial independence as a concept is that judges are allowed to make judicial opinions unconstrained by the preferences of other actors. It's not about how efficient the courts work. It's not about how strong they are in other ways. So you want to be very, very clear on that. Moreover, the concept of judicial independence, I think in much of the literature, has a kind of permanence associated with it, and that's related to sort of the point that Eddie made and that Emily made and also Amanda made. Sort of, can a court really be independent if you're arguing that an incumbent, when it's a little bit inconvenient, can just make it less independent, right? If that threat is always present, can you really talk about an independent court, right? We think of the Supreme Court, for example, as pretty independent because the risk of a president just sort of changing it is very low. It's insulated from that. So to me, that sort of goes towards the core of the argument that you're making, because on the one hand, you're making this argument that you have this sort of slow-moving age that's slowly building up these institutions, these judicial institutions, making them stronger, maybe also more independent. And on the other hand, you make this argument that just when it's a little inconvenient for an incumbent, they can change this at once, right? So then your interpretation of that is like, well, real independence increases as aid increases, but suffers temporary setbacks during elections. But an alternative interpretation is just that the judicial independence that seems to be increasing as aid goes up is really only skin deep, right? And elections are just events that bring it to the surface. That the independence isn't really there, that at any given moment incumbents can choose to ignore what the courts want, set it aside, and move ahead with what they want to do, right? And that's, I think, related to the problems that people have highlighted on the measure that you're using, which has things like the polity constraint measure in it, which right at election time is when the problems with constraints on the executive become most apparent, right? That's where it's likely to show up. You might not see it. The reforms that a leader is implementing at other times might seem to satisfy what we think of as judicial independence, but it's not really tested, and elections just test it. So that's a slightly different story. It's less about sort of direct manipulation of true judicial independence. It's more saying that, well, these reforms are never really getting to what we typically understand with sort of real independence actually means. So that's sort of my big concern. I'm not even sure if you're really after judicial independence or after the strength of courts, but I think you need to address that, sort of what that concept really is, and how you can make sense of a concept like judicial independence that then can change from one year to the next as events change, because that's not how we traditionally think of insulation by the judiciary from politics. Two other quick points. A point that Eddie already touched upon. I found the lag structure that you specified a little ad hoc, and I've never seen an ADL model specified like this. I didn't fully understand why you chose that sort of 4-year lag in the dependent variable. Again, like you have this combination here of a slowly moving variable, independent variable, slowly moving dependent variable, and then this sort of change with the elections that you're trying to model both of those things. I wonder if an error correction model wouldn't be a more appropriate way to do that. But I just wanted to see some more testing of why the specific lag structure that you chose is the appropriate one. And then thirdly, the part, I mean, I kind of, the part that I did not find persuasive in the paper was where you go is the last analysis, where you differentiate between these different competitive elections, closed elections, and dominant elections. Theoretically, I didn't find it persuasive because you make these arguments about post-election insurance, but how is post-election insurance credible when an incumbent can change judicial independence at will, right? That's also part of your argument. So I don't see, why. I mean, if we're working in a theoretical model where an incumbent can at any time manipulate judicial independence, leaving judicial independence in place when you think you might lose an election shouldn't provide much consolation at all. Moreover, it can only provide consolation if you think the incumbent is not guilty of any sort of crimes, right? It's not guilty of corruption. But if you're a corrupt leader, you're probably better off making a deal with whoever replaces you than facing strongly independent courts who are likely to go after you sort of regardless, right? So I didn't find that argument persuasive, that there's really much post-insurance to be had from judicial independence, because if the leader is guilty, you don't want the courts to be independent, and if judicial independence is that easily manipulable, it doesn't really provide a lot of assurance. And also empirically, I don't think it was clear that the coefficients were different. You have it sort of set up into sort of different models and different parts of the data. I just didn't find that to be it wasn't a very strong result, and it didn't seem to me to really contribute to your core enterprise here. Which I take to be the sort of, which I do like, and I want to stress that again. I think the question that you're asking is a really good one to try and answer. It's also a really hard one to try and answer, so we can always nitpick with everything you do. But that last part doesn't really seem to contribute much, at least in my mind. Right.
Right, thanks, Eric. And last but not least, Tim, you want to have comments?
Thank you. So when you announced the order, I was very worried that by going last, I would have nothing to say after all others have spoken. But I'm actually less worried now. So let me start though by saying what is certainly no longer novel to say that I think this is an interesting and really important question, and I appreciate the chance to get to read the paper. I do worry primarily about the theoretical parts of the paper. And for at least some reasons that I think are distinct from what others have said, though related. The first thing is that you list a whole number of reasons why countries or governments should be interested in pursuing judicial independence, completely irrespective of whether they're getting any foreign aid. And so, first of all, I was sort of puzzled about how much then we should have any expectation about foreign aid here contributing. And it seems to me that your main answer basically is that without foreign aid, any commitments that they make to judicial independence are not credible, and so they, for this to then go anywhere, this natural incentive to want to increase judicial independence, you need to somehow tie it to aid commitments. But then your results show that they're actually perfectly capable when push comes to shove, and these are quite small pushes, maybe in close election, that is, that the leaders might not even lose. Judicial independence actually is quickly pushed aside again. And so it seems to me like your empirical findings actually undermine the assumption that's driving setting up the analysis in this way to start with. So the whole aid connection, it seems to me, is to some extent in question here. The second concern I had, and this is related to one of the points that Eddie made, but I want to make it sort of much more generally. There is almost no sense of, theoretically, there's no sense of temporality in here. There's no sense of how quickly things should be expected to be happening. There is no sense of what the duration of any of these processes is. And then you have this tension, as Eric also pointed out, right, between some things that you're measuring using moving averages, but in order to get at effects that you want to claim are single-year effects, that just seems that your empirical setup requires you, it seems to me, to be very clear and to develop specific expectations in the theoretical parts about what the speed is with which we should expect to have an effect on these government programs, the speed with which we expect governments to have a chance of intervening in the judiciary in order to diminish or manipulate judicial independence, or whatever exactly it is that you're measuring here with regard to the judiciary, etc. Sorry, right, yeah. So this is also a couple of places where that becomes, I think, particularly pertinent in the empirical setup. Then is with regard to the difference between dominant, competitive, and close elections. The discussion on page 5 here brings this out first. If I understand it correctly, you're using the ex post results of the elections in order to make this differentiation, after having made the point that, in fact, in a number of cases, the elections that you're looking at might have had quite different results from what's reported. Right? Some of the concerns to not want to have judicial independence is precisely because they might disclose that you manipulated the election results and that the reported results are actually false. And so that seems quite problematic before that, but really what needs to be driving this potential dip in election years, if the logic that you spell out is at work, would have to be expectations. So why do I start forming expectations about the outcome of an election simply on the basis of the calendar year in which the election takes place? That seems to me quite odd. And then the other part where this empirically, I think, quite directly bites, if I understand it correctly, is by using aid commitments. So my understanding is that there's a good bit of the aid literature that suggests it can take years and it's highly variable how much time passes between aid commitments and anything actually getting paid out. So maybe there's a good theoretical case to be made why we should still expect it to be aid commitments when they have these conditionalities attached to them that are driving this, but from what's in the paper right now, that was not apparent to me. And one final point, when you move from the analysis that you call naive to the instrumental variable approach, which of course has many nice features to recommend itself, and I know being very concerned about identification strategies is not just fashionable but also had good uses, but then you dispense with looking specifically at at aid that's actually tied to judicial reforms specifically. And so you're throwing out measurement validity in order to achieve better causal identification. But if what you're measuring is not actually getting at what you're trying to capture theoretically, frankly, I don't care how good your identification strategy is, it's worthless because you're not actually measuring what you're trying to say something about. And so that seems to me a really questionable move, even though, unfortunately, I don't immediately have a nice, neat suggestion for you how to solve it. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tim, and all the discussants. I think Christina has to leave now because she has other stuff to do. So, Joe and Simone, do you want to respond?
I'm happy to respond. First of all, thank you very much. I feel like this was an amazing set of comments. and it's everyone is, you identified problems that are similar, but it's evident that you all are coming from slightly different research areas, and so that it was an excellent way of also seeing how the project appeals to slightly different audiences, right? IR versus comparative. And so I'm just going to, pick on some of the points and just, respond. We've been struggling a little bit with the judicial independence measure, and I think all of you have pointed out the sort of the problems associated with it. I mean, in previous work, joint work, Joe and I have, sort of rejected, polity and other these index-based measures for the reasons that you illustrate in the context of this judicial independence measure. And so I think one way to go forward, and this is basically taking sort of Tim and Eddie's suggestion, is to really think how we can decompose the judicial independence measure, right? To separate out this, the convenient, what did you call it? The convenient non-compliance versus the institutional reform. So I thought that was really something we could do and implement immediately. Regarding the endogenous elections, Eddie, that is absolutely well taken. It didn't occur to me, it probably should have, and that is something that we will definitely take care of. Regarding the sort of the budgeting process, I mean, yes, you're right. Oftentimes projects are committed in a more long-term fashion, but if they fall out of favor, they can be terminated quite quickly. And so we tried to, we chose a moving average, which is, I think, what you suggested. But the real point is, and this has come up in my other work, is that the actual difference between these 5-year cycles and what actually gets dispersed over that 5-year term varies considerably with agency constraints as well as what's going on in overseas in these countries. And so I appreciate your criticism, and maybe what needs to be done, and this was also raised by Tim at the very end, is to devote much more focus or time on like the temporal nature of the aid business, right? This is just thinking in terms of aid business, but also then in terms of judicial independence. Another point that I wanted to address, the temporality. What was it? Concept. Right. So the error correction model, I think that was that's an empirical suggestion by Eric that I think was well taken. So from my perspective, my big takeaway is that we need to improve the causal story and the presentation of the causal story. I think you illustrated some flaws that are currently inherent in the theory. In particular, Tim's presentation at the very end was very, very good. And so I will probably have a couple more comments, but for now let me push it over to Joe and then collect my thoughts and respond again. Thank you.
Okay. I'm recovering my voice, so my voice doesn't carry very well, so I hope you all can hear me. And thank you again. I want to echo Simone's appreciation for all the comments. This is quite helpful. overall, I think what you're part of what you're seeing here is some people who don't study judicial independence try to study it. So this is actually quite helpful, and just really helpful for me to hear your thoughts on this. So I'll address a couple of very specific questions, concerns you had with respect to some of the empirical stuff. And the thing that I'm going to punt on, but I think you're probably absolutely right on, is theoretically thinking about the timing. I just, as a scholar, as somebody who doesn't study judicial independence very much, or doesn't, this is really the first time I've looked into it. I just hadn't really thought about the time horizon in which these kinds of reforms take place. So I appreciate that, and we'll have to think carefully theoretically about what we want to say there. So empirically, a couple of points that I wanted to address, and I'll just sort of pick them out here as I see them. The first is a number of people mentioned what is this judicial independence, and the next step for us, I think, in our response, and this is not a great response insofar as we haven't done it yet, is to take a look at the varieties of democracy data. And I would love to hear anyone's opinions on that data, because they've got some more specific institutional measures. Granted, they're based on, my understanding is that they're based on expert survey or experts assessment of these institutions. But some of the actual specific institutions that Eddie, for example, was talking about, I think are in this varieties of democracy data on the judiciary. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as someone who doesn't study judicial independence, what your thoughts are on, if you've come across and had a look, or maybe you participated in helping construct the varieties of democracy data. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So then, and I completely agree that a next step here is to identify what's the part that's actually doing the moving here. And we can certainly do that with the Linzer data. The issue that I have with the Linzer data and doing that is, given it's a latent measure, there's massive missingness there. And so when we start to disaggregate the index, there's massive missingness on particular components of that index, which they don't have to deal with particularly. I mean, the latent model that they constructed is very helpful in dealing with that issue. But when we break it down to the individual indicators that are used in the latent variable, then we're going to have problems with coverage. And who knows what's going to happen to things like a two-stage model when you start to do that. But anyway, that's my concern with breaking things down to the individual indicators with the Linzer and Staten data. However, with the varieties of democracy data, and again, I want to hear your thoughts on this, is I think we're not going to face that issue of empirical coverage. So Simone told me 3 months ago to get working on it, and I just haven't. So, mea culpa. The second one has to do with the elections, and specifically how we sort of think about the elections and how we measure them. The two points that came out were, one is Eddie's bit about the endogenous election timing, and I completely agree. Every paper that I've used the NELDA data in, I pull it out. I pull out. There's a NELDA variable with I forget the exact name of it, but the idea is whether or not the incumbent specifies it's a fixed electoral cycle, or there's everyone has the expectation that this election was going to happen at some date in the future, and it did actually happen at that date. So there wasn't fiddling around with the election timing. And that, I think, picks up fairly well the fixed elections versus the endogenous elections, at least the ones that are timed to particular events by the incumbent. So I agree with Eddie, and I think we'll just have to test it with that NELDA variable and pull out the right ones. And similarly, thankfully, NELDA does such a great job with this stuff, or at least I think they do. And that is the different types of elections. Tim's point about ex post results versus the a priori expectations on the competitiveness of the elections from NELDA. Presumably what they're picking up is in NELDA is they've got a variable about the a priori expectations about competitiveness, and that's what we should be using instead. Because I completely understand that point, and we just need to sort of look at those. And again, I think we can divide the elections into those that are sort of ex post competitive and those that a priori were thought to be competitive and those a priori that were thought not to be competitive. We're not probably going to get three different levels of competitiveness. Like I could pull out of the ex post election results. It's just going to be competitive or not in the, but I still think it's worth looking at, and I think addresses that point. Let's see here, the lag structure and the moving average. So yeah, I mean, I toyed around with this and trying to figure out what was the best way to set up this model. And so I went first to empirical models of judicial independence and said, well, what are they doing? And they were doing some year-on-year stuff. And so I tried to mimic that. But then coming at it from the aid literature using commitment data. The reason we use commitment data and not disbursement data is because when you start to break down the disbursement data on, and Simone knows this very well, disbursement data on these specific categories of aid, there's just massive missiness, and the data is just not there for this long time period from aid data. Excuse me. So we're not going to get something like the categories of aid that we use to put in the bin of democracy aid. It's just not going to be there for the disbursement data. We just can't use it. So we have to use commitment data. And as a result, we try to use a longer moving average to do that. What it sounds to me like is that we ought to be doing actually more of a panel structure here to it than the year-on-year stuff. Which to my mind initially I'm thinking, well, how do we incorporate these elections into that framework as well? But we can think of ways to do that. Why do we throw a lag dependent variable in there? Well, the treatment variable is the lag 3-year moving average of aid, and the way that the idea of with the lag was simply just if donors are looking at what the most recent realization of judicial independence is if they're looking at that to determine how much aid they should give, then we ought to account for that in the model. And so that, and I tested it both ways, and I thought that would address that issue, but evidently people don't like that. I can take the lag out, and I got some similar results, and then it looked a little bit more like the models that I came across, the other empirical models of judicial independence that I came across in the literature.
Can I just quickly comment on that? Or?
Yeah, please.
But I mean, it's not that I don't like the lag. Well, first of all, I mean, it seems I don't understand the disbursement versus commitment, because in the IV models you don't actually use the specific categories, right? So you could use the disbursement there rather than commitment.
Well, we do with to get democracy aid.
But in the instrumental variable models, you throw out the specific categories. You use it on all aid, or did I miss that? Or
no, I'm sorry. There's three aid types that we look at. One is all aid, which would be economic aid, basically. And there, I don't have to worry about the disbursement versus the other versus commitments.
Right.
But then the main variable that we're looking at in the two-stage model, or the only variable really with the identification strategy, is democracy aid. And from that, we have to build up these specific categories. And a subcomponent of democracy aid is judicial aid. And
but anyway, I mean, I didn't object to using a lag dependent. You have to use a lag dependent variable. I didn't understand the choice of what lags to use, or I didn't find it motivated well. Like sort of like how. Yeah.
So just say more why we choose that. Like we did a moving average on aid of 3 years, and so I said, okay, let's pull the lag back 1 year from that. I guess I could do the 3-year lag, or I could do I could do different year lags on the dependent variable too, and sort of play around with that. But I think in terms of the timing and what it gets at, I actually think I should have started with these long-run multipliers, or looking at the long-run effect in an error correction model. And that's actually the way to look at this and get at that your short-term effect, which I guess theoretically we'd probably find nothing. I mean, assuming this is a long-term process, but that we see a long-term effect. So I think we definitely need to throw those in as I hear you talk about it. And the last thing I'll say from the empirics is Tim's point about identification and throwing measurement validity. Yeah, we don't have an identification strategy for judicial aid. It's just such a small category of aid. We have no idea how to model that from the donor's perspective, some sort of exogenous characteristic. The thing with something like unemployment is it's affecting bigger flows of aid from the donor countries. So it's a good instrument for economic aid. It's a good instrument for democracy aid, which is what we use it for, it's not a good instrument for very small categories of aid because those fluctuate so much from year to year. So, point taken. You're right. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what we can do there. We could throw out the two-stage stuff, I suppose. Yeah, I just don't have an instrument or a identification strategy for these very, very small, tiny categories of aid that fluctuate so much, like judicial aid, at least in the data that we've got.
Simone, before you go, do you want to open up for discussants? I'm going to give you guys the last 5 minutes to respond. We're running out of time, so. Do any of the other discussants? So, Amanda? Amanda, do you have any?
Yeah, I do. Hi, sorry. So I have, a couple of follow-ups on what everybody else has said. Joe, the VDEM data was on the tip of my lips too, and I had just got an email this morning that they have a new release, so it's there, it's ready and waiting. And it was, I mean, Staten was the lead PI in the judicial stuff, and it's just full of data that I think is directly pertinent to this project. And I mean, the validity of this data, I mean, this all remains to be seen, you know, but you've got first mover advantage on this, that it's new, and I think there's a lot there to work at, and that at least, you know, it could start to tell a compelling story with. So that was one of the suggestions that I had. Another one is to look perhaps at the work of Dan Brinks and Abby Blass. Dan Brinks of UT Austin. This is specific to Latin America, but they've worked on developing a measure of judicial independence that decomposes a couple of these dimensions of judicial independence, that at least attempts to decompose the difference between autonomy and authority or power, and so that might be of some use, or related work by Ginsburg and the Constitutions Project. I was trying to think about how you might be able to decompose the LJI index, but I don't think that you could, except by its just constituent parts. One of the other things that I thought about with respect to some of these measurements, again, this is coming from the point of view of somebody who works on judicial independence, that one way might be to maybe disentangle implementation and proposal of reforms. So I mean, right now you're treating this all as one thing, and some of the work that I've done on judicial independence and that like Jody Finkel has looked at is that is trying to isolate those two as two separate processes, and that maybe you would be able to actually explain the proposal based on electoral insecurity or political factors, the proposal of certain reforms, irrespective of whether or not they pass, which might also help you to isolate some of the timing of some of these problems that you've got with time. That said, I realize that, or that I realized as you were talking about it, this might work at cross purposes with your aid data. So I don't know. I don't know where that's going to go, but it's an idea. Another thought I had with respect to that if you can disentangle the proposal as opposed to the implementation, that, within the framework, if you're going to think about this as like, the adoption of these reforms or the acceptance of this aid is a signal to international investors, and in the context of the signaling model, that might, push you towards the acceptance as opposed to the full implementation. That does take years, right? And this is also just a follow-up on Eddie. I have in my notes that it might also help to focus on, in fact, de jure changes and not in behavioral changes. I mean, like the LJI measure is a vast improvement on our understanding and ability to measure judicial independence across time and across countries based on the data that's out there. It's just a huge improvement and a really, really valuable resource. But because it does purport to actually capture behavioral changes, you might actually just be interested in the institutions and not in, as Eddie said, and just like when is tenure changing? when are budget, when are courts, when are they expanding court budgets, and when are they doing this to the Constitutional Tribunal or the Supreme Court, not these other amorphous sort of justice reform. So, those are some of my comments.
Eddie, you want to follow up, and then we'll go into Emily afterwards.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So so I just have a few little empirical things that they've come up, and I just want to sort of highlight them. So that on the error correction model, yeah, before you do that, you should really read the most recent political analysis, because there's a set of articles, and it's pretty clear that these error correction models, if the assumptions aren't met for them, they can create some really crazy results. So just take a look at the sort of the constructive critiques. One that I wanted to bring up, but I didn't, just for time reasons, is on your interaction with the major aid interaction, when you keep it as a continuous interaction, you should probably read this new Jens Heinmuller paper that's been circulating around about the linearity assumption in these interactions, and also the whether you have common support at different levels of the aid variable. So just looking from your results, especially figure 3, it looks like you might not be meeting those assumptions. I mean, I hesitate to bring it up because one of my papers is the example of what not to do, but in the paper, but I think that the arguments he's making is kind of generally right, that we should be careful about these. So I take a look at it. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is you could just nod, I guess. In table 2, columns 2 and 3, you're not using in any way, right? They're just illustrative. In table 2, are you using the columns 2 and 3 in any way?
You're muted, Joe.
I'm not using them in any way. They're just there to illustrate.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Then that's fine. I think it's fine to do that. So you might even just do like an F test of the 2 coefficients on unemployment, then, just to make your point clearer, that you want to show that they generally that they deliver about the same amount of aid regardless of whether it's an election or non-election year, if that's the point of columns 2 and 3.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, just so that we can see it, because you've got different sample sizes and different variances. So just looking at the coefficients and the standard errors isn't exactly clear on that one. So yeah, but
the idea was just that the F stats at the bottom for each particular equation.
Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, I didn't even see that. So I read it too close. Okay, that's fine then. Then you did what you needed to do. So
they're sort of both largish.
Yeah.
They're the same, but they're largish.
Yeah, so you can actually compare those 2 coefficients directly if you wanted to, and just nail it. So I think there's another issue there. Another one that I had a question about was, you said like on the judicial aid, you said that's lumpy, it's small, and it moves a lot from year to year. That sounds like the exact situation where you need an instrument. So so I don't know if I just be careful about it, because like the way you described it makes me think that is exactly the time when you come in to do something about it. And if the problem is that you're not identifying it in the first stage, then there's a different set of issues with the theoretical logic of the identification strategy. So, but anyway, as I said, like it's a really ambitious and kind of neat project. So these are all just sort of part of the journey, right? So. All right, good luck.
Thank you.
Emily?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on something that Eric mentioned, and we haven't talked about your secondary test very much, which is the ones of the different types of how close the election is. And I think you're vastly overstating what you're finding in those results. I don't. Most of them are not significant in any kind of way, and I'm having a hard time believing the claims that you've made empirically. But more than that, when in the theoretical argument, I have a particular issue with the claim that, which is, what's it called? I think it's 3B, hypothesis 3B, that we should see a decrease. Aid investments in courts decrease judicial independence during competitive periods, competitive elections, and I can see arguments that the election would make the aid conditions irrelevant, such that the state's no longer listening to or cares about the aid conditions. But I don't know how the aid and the aid conditions could possibly make it worse than an absence of aid entirely, right? I certainly believe that it's possible that the leader is going to use these. Those are the situations in which the leader is going to go after the courts, but I don't know why aid would magnify that effect in any kind of way. So why it would backfire, which is the claim that you make, but don't describe. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about why you think that's the case.
Okay, Eric, do you have any last points to add? Can you unmute? You have to unmute your microphone.
Okay, yeah, I was talking to myself, clearly, as I often do. I just want to second the point. I think the VDEM data is really useful. The nice thing about that data as well is that they have a lot of specific codes, including sort of whether in a specific year the government tried to purge the court or pack the courts or in other ways sort of attack the courts. And that, I think, is sort of reasonable to associate with election years, for example, and you can then distinguish that with sort of broader concepts like independence. I think actually focusing on that data will also force you to be clearer on what your theoretical concept of interest really is. Because now, to me, it seems like independence is stuff having to do with courts in the way you write the paper, right? So if the courts are stronger, if they work better, that's independence. And looking at the VDEM data, I think will force you to be a little bit more precise in exactly sort of what you mean with that claim, exactly what you think aid should influence, and exactly what you think elections should influence as well. And I look forward to seeing a final version of the paper. I think it's going to be a great paper.
Tim, do you have any last things? I can't see you.
Just a couple of really small things. One is that at least partial way to address the issue that I raised before about sort of how meaningful are these exposed results is to actually interact democracy with the closeness of elections. To me, that would be warranted in any case, since democracy should be really sort of a condition and effect of how you would expect aid for judicial reform to actually affect judicial reform. Second, since you are arguing that the focus on judicial reforms as part of a democracy and governance aid package is a quite recent phenomenon, mostly the last decade or so, is what you say somewhere early in the paper. You might actually be able to use some data that otherwise most of us can't do much with yet because the time series is so short. But the World Justice Project's metrics of judicial systems, which are particularly nice insofar as they actually make the raw data available along with the indices. You can argue over the indices endlessly, but you do get the full set of the raw data, which is extremely rich. And I'm not suggesting you should go on a fishing expedition in those raw data, but if there are specific elements of judicial systems that your way of thinking about these issues theoretically would lead you to expect to actually have an effect, at least for a short number of recent years, you might be able to get incredibly rich data to allow you to really test whether this is happening not just sort of in one particular way, but in a number of ways that all really should be showing an effect if your theoretical argument holds. Thank you. I look forward to later versions.
Hey, thanks, Simone. And Joe, you have the last 5 minutes to respond. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to take up a couple of points, and so one is on Eric. It was part of his first round comments, and then again he he came back to it in the second round. So in your view, this, the way we treat judicial independence is murky, right? I mean, we're not clearly specifying it as, meaning that judges are allowed to make decisions without interference. But the problem is that a lot of these, the judicial systems in these developing countries, often also suffer from capacity issues. So in order to be fully independent, right, or to be able to assume that position where you can, have independence, there needs to be some, like, a capacity building component that helps, to reach that final status of judicial independence. And you mentioned the Supreme Court as an example in the U.S. But if you think of it in a developing country context, the overall systems just aren't as developed. So in my mind, and I'm not an expert on judicial independence, I wonder if we shouldn't think of it slightly more broadly, without losing sight of that judicial independence. But when you look at the distribution of foreign aid projects that are related to state institutions or specifically to judicial independence, there is a variety of goals that include, the division of, strengthening the independence, but also using capacity to build up the basic mechanisms, or the basic what needs to be ensured in the first place. And so do you see the conflict here?
No, so I mean, I completely agree that capacity is really important. So my point was not that independence is the only important thing. My point is that conceptually these things are not the same thing.
Right.
So that
Yes.
if you're building capacity in administrative courts, you're building up the capacity of a local judiciary, eventually that could lead to the courts becoming more independent from the political system. That could be an outcome of it. And I would see that as sort of a long-term outcome of it. That's sort of a characteristic of the system that you reach to a larger or greater degree at some point in time. But these are different things in many ways, right? You could have very you could invest and improve in the capacity of local courts. They can be stronger, and still you don't have courts that can actually constrain the executive in a meaningful way when it comes to sort of election time or so. Right? Those are different concepts. I think the vDem project is good, and Jeff Staten was the program director on the judicial part of this. In distinguishing those things, they have different questions about lower courts, higher courts. They have different questions about constraints on the executive versus the strength of the courts or the functioning of the courts. I think it's important to distinguish these things conceptually, to be aware of what aid is being targeted at. So because most aid, and this I think is a point that Simone made right in the beginning, most aid is focused on capacity. Which again, it could eventually lead to more independence, but we don't know. But it's at the short term, it should increase capacity, not necessarily independence.
Which may be slightly then easier to capture, if we think about the temporal dynamics, right? So there is institutional reform, but prior to that, capacity may be the more immediate outcome. So it's not what we would like, right, to see, what we're interested in. But just like it is with democratic change, there are different things that fall into place.
Well, yeah, but I think this is sort of where the problem with the election argument, the interaction of the election argument and the aid argument comes in. I think the goal of aid is sort of to aid this sort of slow-moving process to make the judiciary stronger, to make it more capable, eventually maybe to make it more independent. And then the argument about elections is very specifically targeted towards one aspect of the judicial system, which is its ability to constrain the highest level executive at a specific moment in time. And maybe some of that aid, it's maybe even democracy aid is focused on that, right? But to me, those are slightly different things, and I saw like a bit of a tension in the paper on that I think you need to address a little bit. I think I see the logic of both arguments, but they're not quite talking about the same thing.
I have a quick follow-up on that. I think that, just to weigh in on this, I think that of all of the judicial reforms that I've looked at that have been proposed by aid organizations or legislators around the world, nearly all of them cite judicial independence as a goal because it sounds really good, right? And it's a great way to sell this reform to investors or constituents or whatever, right? And so that's also part of what makes your question really interesting. Is once you guys can tease out all of these longer term effects, if you find that all of these projects don't in fact improve judicial independence, that's interesting, right? And that's I think is going to be a cynical but interesting finding for to inform future aid projects, I think. So it might be sort of a way to frame the argument or frame your results in the future.
Okay, so we're about out of time. So, Simone and Joe, do you have any final last words?
Two quick points. The way I see the closest of election results was pretty much had to do with the some scope conditions. Basically, there's certain kinds of elections. As Eddie pointed out, there are other kinds of elections on a different dimension that may not be relevant for the theory. So it was an attempt to get at that. So I hear the point about things not being totally significant and the interpretation of those things. And we can be much more clear on that. Tim's idea about democracy and elections interaction, he's totally right. We've tested it. It was in an earlier version of this stuff. I just never want to do triple interaction terms again in a paper. It gets messy quickly. I promise myself I'd never do that again. And then my last thing is just many thanks. This has been hugely helpful. So very much thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. This was excellent. Really.
Well, thanks for sharing the paper.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone for discussing. This was a very productive discussion. And I hope we can call on you in the future.
Thanks for setting it up, Raymond.
Thanks so much.
Happy to return the favor.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.